Somewhere past mile 1000 of the Alaska Highway, Yukon Territory, late September 1943, 4 in the afternoon. A constable of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, posted that summer to one of the road detachments the force had just established along the Yukon section, has pulled his truck onto the shoulder and got out. He is not looking at the road ahead of him. He is looking at 200 yards of it behind him, where the surface has begun to sag along one edge in a way it was not sagging a week ago. What he is reading is the ground under the fill. This stretch was built fast, in a hurry, over frozen and half-frozen muskeg, with spruce laid crosswise and gravel pushed on top of it. When the insulating cover came off the permafrost, the ground underneath began doing what that ground does. He has been on this section of road for about 11 weeks. He knows the sag is new. He knows what it will mean for a loaded freight truck at 2 in the morning. And he has no way to tell anyone. There is no police radio in his detachment. The nearest telephone line along the right-of-way belongs to another country's army. The next mounted police post in either direction is a distance he measures in hours rather than miles, because on this road a mile is not a stable unit of anything. 11 weeks earlier he had never seen this road. Neither had anybody else in the force. The road was 19 months old. The detachment he was working out of was younger than that. So what does an officer actually know about a territory he has been in for 11 weeks? And what does he have to learn first? What he has to learn first is that the road is not a fixed object. Construction had begun at Dawson Creek, British Columbia, on the 8th of March 1942. 7 United States Army engineer regiments, working with the Public Roads Administration and dozens of contractors, punched a pioneer road through more than 1,000 miles of country in 8 months and 12 days. The pioneer road was 12 feet wide, with 3-foot shoulders and grades up to 10%. Where it crossed thawing muskeg, it was corduroy. Trees felled on site and laid across the mud, and it was not actually passable by vehicle until 1943, when the Public Roads Administration widened it to 24 feet with 6-foot shoulders. Through travel first became possible on the 25th of October 1942. The link-up near Beaver Creek came on the 28th. The dedication ceremony at Soldiers Summit was held on the 20th of November, at 15 below zero. Sources give the length as anywhere from 1,523 to 1,543 miles, depending on what is being measured and when. Parks Canada's own record states it plainly. Relying on local native guides and generally following existing trails, American military and civilian personnel finished the road in under 10 months, and by the end of 1943, Dawson Creek and Fairbanks were linked by 1,523 miles of all-weather road. Then the mounted police were told to police it. The force's own annual report for 1944 records the decision in a single administrative sentence. With the completion of the highway in 1943, RCMP detachments were located along the Yukon portion of the road to provide supervision over its use. That is the entire operational order. A road existed. Supervise its use. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place built in the officer who covered the same ground in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not Mountie mythology. The documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. What did a posting on that road give an officer that no GPS and no centralized dispatch has ever been designed to hold? And if you served in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you served on a detachment where the road arrived before the police did, or your father or your grandmother did, what was the first thing that posting taught them that no training had covered? Next on this channel, the Yukon Winter Road Patrol after 1946. What a detachment did when a truck went off the grade at 40 below and the nearest wrecker was 200 miles behind it. Back on the road. Supervise its use. Along 1,500 miles of road, of which roughly 600 ran through the Yukon, with no municipalities, no street names, no house numbers and, for long stretches, no permanent population at all. So the first thing the constable had to learn was the address system, and the address system was the mile. The road had been built with mileposts because the Army needed to organize itself along a line. To house the workforce, line camps of roughly 100 to 200 men were established every 10 to 15 miles along the road. Those camps became the reference points. A report of trouble did not come in as an address. It came in as a number, a mile, or a camp, or a creek crossing. And the numbers moved. The road was being straightened and rebuilt continuously through 1943 and 1944. Curves taken out, grades cut down, whole sections relocated onto better ground. A milepost that had been driven in during the Pioneer Road period could end up half a mile from where the road now ran. The Yukon's own history of this period is unambiguous that the road as built in 1942 and the road as it existed 2 years later were not the same road in many places. So the mile became something the officer carried rather than something he read. He knew that mile such and such meant the long grade before the creek, not the post, because the post was wrong. He knew which numbers people actually used and which ones only appeared on paper. None of that was written down anywhere by anyone whose job it was to write things down. If the address system itself had to be held in an officer's head, what happened to it in the 6 months of the year when the road stopped behaving like a road at all? In winter, the road became reliable and lethal at the same time. Frozen, it was the best surface it ever offered. The muskeg was solid. The mud was gone. A truck could make time on it. That was exactly the problem, because everything else about winter was working the other way. Southern Yukon in these years routinely produced temperatures in the -40 and -50 range through January and February. The winter of 1942 to 1943 saw record lows reported in the corridor of 60 and 70 below Fahrenheit. 4 years later, at Snag, an hour's flying west of the highway, an official reading of 83 below Fahrenheit was recorded, the lowest ever taken in North America. At those temperatures, the operational facts change. A vehicle that is shut off may not restart. Steel becomes brittle. A tire goes flat in a shape it keeps. A man who breaks down 20 miles from anything is not inconvenienced. He is on a clock. So the constable's winter knowledge was not driving skill. It was a set of specific local facts. Which cut banks caught the northwest wind and drifted first? Which grade held ice under snow because the sun never touched it? Which maintenance camp would still have a fire going at 3 in the morning, and which one had been pulled back for the season? How long a stalled truck had before the cab was no longer survivable? At this temperature, in this wind, on this stretch. That last calculation was the whole job, and it was different at mile 900 than it was at mile 1100. If winter was survivable because the road was frozen, what did the officer face in the 6 weeks of the year when it thawed? Breakup answered it. Every spring the road came apart. The permafrost under the fill began to release. Corduroy logs that had been buried surfaced through the gravel. Culverts blocked with ice, then let go all at once, and took the fill with them. Ruts filled with water, and deepened under every vehicle that used them, so that the road destroyed itself faster the more it was used. For a police officer, this produced a specific and unusual operational condition. For several weeks each year, his territory was not continuously accessible by the only vehicle he had, which meant the older methods were not historical curiosities. They were current equipment. Dog teams were still in RCMP service through this period and would remain so for decades. The force's last dog sled patrol did not set out until the winter of 1969, from Old Crow, when snowmobiles and aircraft finally replaced the teams. Riverboats worked the Yukon and Teslin systems. Charter aircraft, flying out of a corridor that had been built in the first place to serve the airfields of the Northwest staging route, could reach places the road could not. So the constable's real question during breakup was never, "How do I drive there?" It was, "Which of 4 methods gets me there this week, and what does the country between here and there look like right now?" A man who had been on the road 2 months could not answer that. A man who had been there through 2 breakups could. The knowledge, in other words, was accumulating in him at a rate the institution had no way to measure. So what was that road actually doing to the country it had been driven through? This is the part of the subject that cannot be told as an engineering story. There was no consultation with Indigenous peoples when the decision to build the highway was made. The road followed existing trails and was guided by local native guides. The routes were already there, and the knowledge that found them belonged to the people whose country it was. What came up the road behind that was not survivable in the same way. Outsiders brought diseases, measles, meningitis, which became epidemics in the small communities along the route, causing deaths at Teslin and at Burwash. One account of Teslin records that a year after the American soldiers arrived, 128 of the 135 Teslin Tlingit were sick with measles. That is not a proportion, that is a community. Military personnel overhunted big game, often abandoning carcasses, depleting the wildlife that the subsistence economy along the corridor depended on. Then, in 1943, the Kluane Game Sanctuary was established over more than 10,000 square miles of prime hunting ground, and it prohibited traditional indigenous harvesting on land that had been used for generations, in order to rehabilitate stocks that outsiders had reduced. So a constable patrolling that road in 1944 was moving through communities that had, within 24 months, been given an epidemic, a collapsed hunting economy, a wage economy, alcohol at the camps, and a legal prohibition on feeding themselves the way they always had. None of it had been asked for. He was, in that country, the visible representative of the government that had done it. What did that make him, operationally? And what did it make him to the people he was policing? It made him two things at once, and both of them are documented. Operationally, he was often the only official presence for 100 miles. The man who carried the mail, drove the sick to the nearest doctor, pulled the stranded truck out of the ditch, took the report, made the decision. In a corridor with no hospitals, no municipal services, and no telephone a civilian could use, that function was real, and people used it. And the institution he served was, in exactly these years, doing other things. The same force assisted in the confiscation and disposal of Japanese property during the wartime dispossession of Japanese Canadians. It was enforcing the Defense of Canada regulations, registering enemy aliens, and had re-engaged some 1,600 former members as special constables to carry the load. And it held a role in the residential school system that the force itself now documents. After the 1920 Indian Act Amendment made attendance mandatory, police, and in particular the RCMP, acted as truant officers, capturing absentees, returning runaway students, and fining or arresting parents who refused or resisted, work the force billed back to the Department of Indian Affairs, at a cost that by the 1940s had grown burdensome enough that the department asked Indian agents and school principals to take it over themselves. In the Yukon, that system had an address of its own. The Choutla School at Carcross had been operating since 1911, and it would not close until 1969. Both of these are the same decade, the same force, and sometimes the same constable. What happened to that road, and to the man who had learned it, when the war it was built for ended? The war ended and the road stayed. In 1946, the 1,221 miles of highway inside Canada came under exclusive Canadian control. Maintenance passed to the Canadian Army. The American engineer regiments went home. The line camps emptied. The road was not open to the general public until 1948. But freight moved, contractors moved, and the corridor began filling with people who had come because the road existed. For the force, this changed the arithmetic. What had been a wartime supervision task on a military road became ordinary territorial policing on a permanent highway. Detachments that had been thrown up in log buildings beside the grade were rebuilt in frame. Postings that had been temporary became careers. Communications improved slowly and unevenly. The Northwest Territories and Yukon radio system had existed since 1923, when the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals linked Dawson and Mayo, and it expanded through the 30s and 40s. And from June 1942, the U.S. Army Signal Corps telephone and telegraph line ran the length of the corridor from Edmonton. Records for comparable northern detachments in this decade describe the transition as gradual, station by station, rather than as a single date. The precise year in which a given highway detachment could reliably raise anyone by radio is not established in the available record, and this script does not claim one. What is established is the direction of travel. Every year after 1946, a little more of what the officer had to hold in his own head could, in principle, be held somewhere else. So what exactly was in his head by then? By the late 1940s, a man who had come to that road in 1943 had been through 6 breakups and 6 winters. Here is the insider part, and it is the reason this subject is worth documenting. He did not know the road as a route. He knew it as a set of behaviors. He knew that a particular cut bank drifted before any other, and that the drift built from the west side. He knew which creek ran dirty 2 days before it took the culvert. He knew that a certain grade, freshly rebuilt, was more dangerous than the bad old alignment it replaced, because people drove it faster. He knew who ran which roadhouse, who was reliable with a tow chain, which camp cook would let a stranded driver sit by the stove, and which would not. He knew, without being told, what a call from mile such and such in March was likely to actually be. Not one item on that list appears in a force manual. Not one of them could be put on a radio message even after the radio arrived, because radio transmits reports, and this was not a report. It was a model of a specific 600 miles of country, built by driving it 4,000 times. The force never asked him to write it down. It had no form for it. There was no field in any ledger in Ottawa for what a man knew about the way snow moved across the grade at mile 1080. So when the institution eventually decided that officers should be interchangeable, what happened to it? The specific institutional end came in stages, and the dates are documented. In 1946, the Canadian section of the Alaska Highway passed to exclusive Canadian control, and the wartime arrangement ended. In 1948, the road opened to the public. Through the decades that followed, the Yukon detachments were absorbed into a national system of standardized training, centralized dispatch, and regular transfer, the model under which no officer stays in one territory long enough for the territory to become the largest thing he knows. What the change gave the institution was real, and should be stated without irony. Consistent standards, accountability that did not depend on the character of one isolated man, relief for officers who had been carrying impossible postings alone, oversight in a force whose conduct in northern and Indigenous communities in these very decades badly needed it. Interchangeable officers can be supported, supervised, replaced when they fail, and sent where they are needed. That is not a small gain. In some communities along that road, it was the only protection available. What it did not give the road was the man who had been on it for 6 years. The new system got there. It got there faster, with better equipment, in contact the whole way. It did not know that the drift at that cut bank builds from the west, or that the march calls from that mile are never what the caller says they are. Nobody asked what that thing was before he was transferred out. The road is still there. It still behaves the same way. The muskeg still moves. The knowledge is somewhere else now, and mostly it is nowhere. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more roads, more detachments, more crossings, more calls with 3 pieces of information the dispatch did not contain, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. 6 years on that road gave a man something no GPS unit and no dispatch console has ever had a place to store. And if you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter road, a detachment, put it in the comments. If your family served where the road arrived before the police did, tell us what that posting taught them that no training ever covered. Next time on this channel, the Yukon Winter Road Patrol after 1946. A truck off the grade at 40 below, and the nearest wrecker 200 miles behind it.